Imagine the middle of the 19th century. Gas lamps glow along the platform. And for the very first time in your life, you step into a train that will carry you through the night. No one truly knows what awaits you, because this kind of journey is still new to everyone. Your grandfather traveled by stagecoach, sleeping at roadside inns. Your father rode in carriages and stayed in hotels along the way. But you are about to experience something entirely different. A place where motion and sleep merge into an unfamiliar, almost unreal sensation. What happens to a person when the ground slips away beneath them at nearly 30 versts an hour? And sleep must be found here and now, inside this rattling machine of iron. When the first railway lines spread across Europe and America in the 1830s, night travel was hardly considered at all. Railways were imagined as daytime marvels, a celebration of speed, progress, and modernity. Early routes were short and sensible. Liverpool to Manchester, St. Petersburg to Tsarskoye Selo. Traveling out and back within daylight hours seemed perfectly reasonable. But ambition grew quickly within just a few years. Soon people wanted to link London with Edinburgh, Moscow with St. Petersburg, New York with Chicago. And suddenly, journeys no longer lasted 3 hours, but 20. A traveler who set off in the morning might discover by evening that 12 long hours still lay ahead. What was one supposed to do with the night? The first attempts at sleeping on trains were, to put it mildly, heroic. Early railway carriages resembled horse-drawn coaches placed on rails. The same rigid wooden benches, the same narrow windows, yet the motion was entirely different. A carriage swayed gently, almost like an awkward cradle. Hooves, springs, and soft dirt roads created a familiar rhythm. A train offered no such comfort. Iron struck iron. Rail joints, still unsmoothed and unwelded, sent sharp jolts through the carriage. The wagon leapt and shuddered, roaring so loudly it felt as though a blacksmith were hammering metal inside. Passengers described the experience as a form of torment. One English gentleman wrote in his diary in 1839, "I attempted to sleep, but each air of the wheels echoed through my spine, as if a stick were striking my back. And yet humans are remarkably adaptable creatures." Within just a few years of regular night travel, passengers began developing their own tricks. Seasoned travelers carried pillows, not small cushions, but full feather pillows from home. They tucked them beneath their heads, pressed them against their sides, wedged them between their bodies and the carriage wall, doing whatever they could to soften the relentless blows of the road. Women brought shawls, many shawls. They wrapped themselves in layers, pulled them over their shoulders, folded them into makeshift rolls to support their necks or backs. Men, especially those with fewer means, simply pulled their coats over their heads and tried to force their minds into rest through sheer determination. What's striking is that the very idea of sleeping, while in motion, felt deeply unnatural at the time. For a person of the 19th century, sleep was inseparable from stillness, shelter, and protection. A proper bedroom, a bed with a canopy, heavy curtains drawn across the windows. That was was where respectable people slept. Here, however, one was expected to fall asleep in a public space, surrounded by strangers, and while moving, many genuinely feared it was harmful. Doctors of the era seriously debated whether sleeping on a train might damage the brain or disrupt the body's natural rhythms. Medical journals even published warnings about the dangers of railway sleep. Some claimed that constant vibration could lead to nervous disorders, that those who slept regularly on trains would become irritable, unstable, even lose their sanity. These anxieties were fueled by a simple fact. Early trains were in truth dangerous. Accidents were common. Rails cracked. Bridges failed. Locomotives derailed. To fall asleep on a train meant placing your life in the hands of a machine and its crew. What if something happened while you slept? What if a fire broke out and you didn't wake in time? These fears were not imagined. Wooden carriages, lit by kerosene lamps and heated by stoves, burned easily like tinder. For this reason, many passengers refused to sleep on night trains at all. They chose to remain awake, reading by dim lamplight or staring into the darkness beyond the window. Yet, the most remarkable change began when people finally did start to sleep. They discovered that sleep on a train was a peculiar state, not the deep rest of one's own bed, and not the light doze of an armchair. Something in between. The steady rhythm of the wheels created a monotonous pulse that, strangely enough, soothed the mind. The motion of the carriage, though rough, followed a pattern. Gradually, the body learned to anticipate it. Muscles loosened. Resistance faded. Slowly, a new culture of rest took shape, a culture of railway sleep, with its own habits and unspoken rules. Conductors were among the first to recognize that night passengers were different. Exhausted, irritable, desperately in need of even the smallest comforts, railway companies began to respond. At first, cautiously, seats became slightly softer. Then benches gained backrests. Eventually, someone realized that a backrest could recline, allowing a passenger to stretch out just a little. Each improvement felt revolutionary. By the late 1840s, it was clear that a night train was not simply a train traveling after dark. It was a distinct environment, one that demanded special conditions. And this is where things grew truly interesting. A quiet competition began, a struggle for the quality of a passenger's sleep. Companies understood that whoever could offer genuine rest would gain a powerful advantage. Travelers were willing to pay more not for speed, but for the chance to arrive rested. Showing up exhausted to an important meeting or a family visit was both impractical and embarrassing. Between 1845 and 1850, a true race of innovation unfolded. Each railway company sought its own solution, its own signature improvement. Curtains appeared between seats, offering at least the illusion of privacy. Gas lighting was introduced, with the ability to dim the lamps at night. Some even experimented with suspended bunks, though these were quickly abandoned, as passengers were thrown from them during sudden stops. Most importantly, people adapted. What had seemed impossible to their parents became routine. By the 1850s, young travelers accepted night trains as a normal part of life. They learned to sleep to the rhythm of the wheels, to ignore a neighbor's snoring, to doze half-sitting while clutching a small suitcase to their chest. A new kind of traveler emerged, a person of the railway age, for whom sleeping on the move was as natural as sleeping at home. But let's be honest, romance aside, the reality was far harsher. You can grow used to almost anything, but that doesn't mean it was comfortable. Not at all. And to truly understand what those first night passengers endured, we need to step inside those carriages, to look closely at the wooden benches where no position brought relief, to feel the surfaces worn smooth by restless bodies, to smell the kerosene fumes from the lamps, clinging stubbornly to clothes and hair, to feel your legs go numb after 8 hours in the same position. This is what we're really talking about now, the unpolished, unromantic truth of the first night trains. Imagine a railway carriage in the year 1845, a wooden box on wheels, about 12 meters long and 3 meters wide. Inside, 2 long benches ran along the walls, facing each other. Bare wood, roughly planed, not polished. Run your hand carelessly along the surface, and you could easily pick up a splinter. Backrests were a luxury, depending entirely on the class of the carriage and the generosity of the company. In the best case, there was a simple wooden board set at a strict 90-degree angle to the seat. No incline, no lumbar support, just a vertical surface you could lean against if you were desperate enough. Now imagine sitting on such a bench for 10 hours, not just sitting, trying to sleep. The first hour you manage. Your back is straight, posture dignified. By the second hour, discomfort creeps in. By the third, your hips begin to go numb. Wood is wood, after all. By the 5th hour, you would gladly trade half your fortune for a pillow. By the 7th, you would give anything simply to lie down. By the 10th hour of the journey, you are no longer quite human, just an exhausted creature cycling through every imaginable position, hopping to find something even remotely bearable. Seasoned travelers knew the rules. The most important one: never, never board a night train without your own pillow. A pillow was not a luxury. It was survival equipment. You could place it behind your back, under your side, beneath your head. You could wedge it between your body and the wall, creating at least the illusion of softness. Some particularly clever passengers brought 2 pillows, one for the seat, one for the head. Women in this regard were often more practical than men. They arrived carrying entire bundles: shawls, blankets, travel quilts, small bags stuffed with useful things. And rightly so, everything came in handy. Still, a pillow solved only part of the problem. The bigger question remained: how does one sleep while sitting? Anyone who has never tried to sleep upright for several hours cannot fully grasp the difficulty. Your head keeps falling forward. Your neck stiffens. Your jaw slackens. Saliva follows, romantic, hardly. Some tried leaning their heads back. That only shifted the pain to the other side of the neck and opened the mouth wider, making snoring thunderous. The most inventive passengers devised a solution. They brought a wide leather belt or a scarf, wrapped it around their head, and tied it to the luggage rack above. It formed a crude support, preventing the head from collapsing forward. It looked ridiculous, but it worked. At least the neck suffered less. True, by morning, a red mark remained across the forehead, but that seemed a small price to pay for a few hours of relative peace. Now imagine you are not traveling alone. The carriage is packed shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee. Less than a meter separates the benches. Your legs constantly brush against the legs of the passenger opposite you. If they are tall, there is nowhere to put your feet at all. You end up weaving them into strange, uncomfortable shapes. And then the person opposite decides to fall asleep. Their head drops forward, straight onto your knee. What do? Pushing them away feels rude. Enduring it is miserable. Welcome to the quiet social drama of Victorian travel. Lighting added its own peculiar charm. 1 or 2 kerosene lamps for the entire carriage. Dim, flickering light that cast unsettling shadows. Soot gathered in dark streaks along the ceiling. The smell of kerosene mixed with unwashed bodies, tobacco, and food. By the end of the journey, the air grew thick and stale, heavy enough to cause headaches. Ventilation. You could open a window, but then smoke from the locomotive, coal dust, and sparks rushed straight in, stifling heat or choking soot. That was the night passenger's dilemma, and things became even more interesting when class came into play. Because even in these harsh conditions, comfort had a hierarchy. 3rd class was exactly what we've just described. Bare wooden benches, minimal light, maximum crowding. Workers, small traders, laborers heading off in search of work. They slept however they could, often leaning against one another, forming human piles to conserve warmth. Modesty gave way to exhaustion. The main concern was not falling off the bench during a sharp turn. 2nd class was slightly more merciful. The benches were the same, but backrests were guaranteed. There was a little more space per person. Sometimes there were thin, padded inserts made of horsehair stuffed into canvas. Not comfortable, but tolerable. The crowd was more restrained. Minor officials, teachers, modest merchants. Here, people at least attempted to maintain a sense of propriety. Men removed their hats. Women adjusted their skirts. Snoring was politely restrained, at least until 3 in the morning, when all such conventions quietly collapsed, and first class of the 1840s, don't rush to imagine luxury. It was still a wooden carriage, with the same windows and the same thunder of wheels, but the benches were upholstered in velvet or leather. The backrests leaned slightly backward, perhaps 5 degrees at most, yet even this felt like a breakthrough. There was more space between seats. You could stretch your legs without colliding with your neighbor. The lamps burned brighter. The air felt cleaner. The company was selective. First class was reserved for aristocrats, wealthy industrialists, senior officials. They arrived with servants who carried enormous valises packed with travel necessities. From these bags emerged small marvels of comfort, dressing gowns, soft slippers, nightcaps, even portable writing desks. Servants spread fur blankets, arranged pillows, fetched hot tea from the buffet car in insulated flasks. By modern standards, the conditions were still austere, but compared to third class, this was paradise. The wealthiest travelers went further still. They booked private compartments, a small enclosed section for 4 to 6 people with a door. It cost as much as 3 first-class tickets, but it offered something priceless: privacy. Jackets could be removed, corsets loosened. One could stretch out along the bench at full length. True, the bench was still too short, and legs had to be propped up on the opposite seat. But these were minor inconveniences by comparison. What's remarkable is that an entire industry quickly sprang up around the discomfort of railway travel. Enterprising minds realized that suffering could be profitable. Shops began selling special travel pillows, long cylindrical rolls designed to wrap around the neck. Inflatable rubber cushions, pumped up and placed under the back or head. Folding footrests, wooden, jointed constructions that could be set up between seats. Travel blankets made of camel wool, light, warm, compact. Entire catalogs were published, offering advice to travelers in a serious, authoritative tone. Be sure to carry a vial of ammonia in case of suffocating air. Do not forget spare handkerchiefs. They will help protect against smoke. We recommend dry bread and apples. Light food does not burden the stomach during sleep. Some advice bordered on the absurd. Tie your luggage to your wrist with a rope to prevent theft while sleeping. Picture it: a person asleep, a suitcase tethered to their arm. For women, the challenges were doubled. Corsets restricted breathing. Crinolined skirts took up so much space that sitting properly was nearly impossible. Social norms demanded legs kept together, posture upright, even when exhaustion became unbearable. Many women simply did not sleep on night trains at all. They sat through the entire night with straight backs, afraid to let their heads fall forward and appear improper. Only toward morning, when fatigue finally prevailed, did they allow themselves to close their eyes, leaning against a companion's shoulder or the carriage wall. By the end of the 1840s, a familiar figure had emerged: the night passenger, rumpled, red-eyed, limbs stiff with numbness, head aching from stale air and kerosene fumes. They stepped off the train swaying with exhaustion, immediately searching for an inn where they could finally sleep in a real bed. A night on the train was never considered proper rest. It was survival, a way to endure the journey until its end. And all of this was in warm weather. But what happened in winter, when the misery of hard benches was joined by biting cold? When frost formed on the inside of the windows and breath turned to vapor? When passengers shivered so violently they could not sleep even if they wanted to? That was an entirely different story. A story of how people struggled to preserve warmth. And life itself, inside a wooden box, racing through the winter night. In winter, discomfort became more than unpleasant. Sleep turned into a genuinely dangerous endeavor. The enemy was cold. real, bone-deep cold inside a carriage hurtling through darkness. A wooden railway car in 1845 was, in essence, a shed on wheels. Gaps between the boards let wind whistle freely inside. Single-pane windows barely held any heat. The floor, made of loosely fitted planks, drew cold straight up from the ground, and the carriage moved at nearly 40 versts an hour, creating an additional stream of icy air. Early railway companies gave little thought to heating. Truly, they assumed that since journeys lasted only a few hours, passengers would manage, put on a warm coat, and endure. This logic worked in summer and autumn, but when the first true frosts arrived, -20, -25 degrees, it became clear that no coat was enough. People often arrived at their destinations with serious health consequences. Some suffered damage to their toes, others to their ears or noses. One of the earliest documented cases of widespread injury occurred in the winter of 1842 on the railway line between St. Petersburg and Moscow. A train became trapped in snowdrifts for 6 hours. The temperature outside dropped to -32 degrees. Inside the carriages, there was no heating at all. By the time the train was finally dug out and brought to the station, many passengers required urgent medical attention. After this incident, the imperial government issued a decree. All passenger carriages were required to have heating during winter travel. But how was that to be achieved? The first solution was simple and dangerous: iron stoves. Ordinary metal stoves, fueled by coal or firewood, were installed either in the center of the carriage or in a corner. A pipe led upward through the roof. At first glance, the problem seemed solved. In reality, the troubles were only beginning. A red-hot iron stove inside a wooden carriage, packed with people wrapped in heavy woolen clothing, was a recipe for disaster. Fires broke out regularly. Someone added too much coal. The stove overheated, and the wooden floor began to smolder. During sudden braking, burning embers could spill from the open door straight onto the planks. Sometimes sparks traveled back down the chimney through a faulty joint and ignited nearby materials. In the winter of 1845 alone, 12 passenger carriages in England were damaged in a single season. Stoves were the cause. Panicked passengers fled smoke-filled cars at stations whenever they could. Yet, even when fires were avoided, the stove created new problems. Heat spread unevenly. Those seated near the stove suffocated from the heat, removing coats, unbuttoning shirts, fanning themselves desperately. Meanwhile, passengers at the far end of the carriage could still see their breath clouding the air. One carriage, two climates: tropics by the stove, Arctic conditions by the doors. Conflicts were inevitable. The freezing passengers demanded more coal. The overheated ones insisted the fire be reduced or the windows opened. Conductors were caught between these opposing demands. Arguments grew loud. Accusations flew. So much for the calm civility of the 19th century. The situation was made worse by the need to constantly feed the stove. At stations, a conductor would leap into the carriage carrying a bucket of coal, hurriedly stoking the fire. But if stations were far apart, the fuel ran out, the stove cooled, and the cold returned. Passengers knocked on the service compartment door, demanding heat. Sometimes anything combustible was used: wooden crates, luggage, even books and newspapers. Those who traveled often learned to prepare for winter journeys with care. Along with warm clothing, they carried heating devices. Not electric ones, of course. Those did not yet exist. There were two main types: metal and ceramic. A metal warmer was a flat flask filled with hot water. It was filled with boiling water at a station, wrapped in cloth, and placed under the feet or pressed against the stomach. The warmth lasted 3 or 4 hours. After that, the flask cooled and became a cold slab of metal. Ceramic warmers were more elaborate. Flat clay vessels with lids, filled with heated stones or slow-burning charcoal tablets. They could produce heat for up to 8 hours, but they were dangerous. Improperly wrapped, they caused burns through clothing. Dropped, they shattered, scattering glowing embers across the floor. The most common and affordable solution was the hot brick. Simple, cheap, effective. At stations, for a small fee, passengers could receive a brick heated in a stove until it was nearly glowing. Wrapped in layers of newspaper or cloth, it was handed over and placed beneath the feet. Such a brick provided warmth for 2 or 3 hours. The main danger was forgetting it on the floor when leaving burns were common. Third-class passengers sometimes pooled their money for a single brick, placing it in the center of the carriage and warming their feet in turns. Fur blankets were the privilege of the wealthy. Bear, wolf, sable, any hide that trapped heat was used. Wrapped completely in fur, one could survive even severe frost. Breathing beneath the heavy pelts was difficult, but there were few alternatives. Some travelers brought early versions of sleeping bags, sewn from sheepskin or reindeer hide. You climbed inside, pulled the drawstring tight at the opening, and sealed yourself into a cocoon. Warmth came at a price. You couldn't get out quickly. If the train braked suddenly, there was a real risk of sliding off the bench and ending up on the floor, curled like a helpless creature. And the windows, the windows in winter, deserve a story of their own. When frost ruled outside, and even a small amount of warmth built up inside from the stove, and from human breath, condensation formed on the glass. It froze almost instantly, turning into a thick crust of ice. By the middle of the night, the windows were covered with elaborate frost patterns, hiding everything beyond the carriage. Beautiful, undeniably. Practical, not in the slightest, because it meant that moisture from the air was settling everywhere. If it gathered on the windows, it also coated the walls and ceiling. By morning, the carriage felt damp. Clothes grew heavy with moisture. Hair turned wet. Bedding became clammy with condensation. That dampness seeped deep into the body. Many passengers fell ill after winter night journeys: bronchitis, pneumonia, rheumatism. The elderly and children suffered most. Doctors warned that winter rail travel demanded particular caution. But what were people to do if travel was unavoidable? Interestingly, approaches to winter heating differed between America and Europe. Europeans, especially the British, endured the cold with stoic resolve. There was a prevailing philosophy: a gentleman does not complain about discomfort. For this reason, British railway companies resisted installing heating for a long time. Their attitude was simple: put on a warm coat and stop grumbling. Only after several public scandals and legal disputes did they begin, reluctantly, to introduce stoves. Americans, by contrast, were more pragmatic. They quickly realized that frozen passengers were bad for business. It was warm inside, but getting out quickly was nearly impossible. If the train stopped suddenly, you could easily slide off the bench and end up sprawled on the floor like a helpless grub. And the windows, oh, the windows in winter, deserve a poem of their own. When frost ruled outside, and the carriage held even a hint of warmth from the stove and human breath, condensation formed on the glass from the inside. It froze almost instantly, turning into a thick layer of frost. By the middle of the night, the windows were covered in intricate ice patterns so dense that nothing beyond the train could be seen. Beautiful, without question; practical, not at all, because that frost meant moisture was settling everywhere. If it gathered on the windows, it also clung to the walls and ceiling. By morning, the carriage felt damp and heavy. Clothes grew clammy, hair turned moist, and bedding became unpleasantly sticky with condensation. The cold dampness seeped deep into the body. After winter night journeys, many passengers fell ill: bronchitis, pneumonia, aching joints. The elderly and children suffered most. Doctors warned that traveling by train in winter required special caution. But what choice did people have when travel was unavoidable? Interestingly, Europe and America approached winter heating very differently. Europeans, especially the British, endured the cold with stoic pride. There was a prevailing belief that a true gentleman did not complain about discomfort. As a result, British railway companies resisted installing heating for years. Their attitude was simple: wear a warm coat and stop whining. Only after public scandals and legal disputes did they reluctantly begin adding stoves. Americans, however, were more pragmatic. They quickly realized that frozen passengers made for bad business. Various solutions were tested. Steam heating was tried, channeling steam from the locomotive through pipes into the carriages. It worked, but required a complex system of valves and tubing. Other trains used metal braziers filled with hot coals beneath the floors, dangerous, yet effective. Russia followed an entirely different path. With far harsher winters, the solutions were more extreme. Some carriages were equipped with 2 stoves, one at each end, with a conductor stationed between them to ensure even heating. Russians also introduced double window frames, an early ancestor of modern double glazing, stuffing cotton or moss between the panes for insulation. It helped, though not dramatically. There were also absurd incidents. In the winter of 1849, passengers in third-class cars on the Moscow-Nizhny Novgorod line became so cold that they began breaking apart the wooden benches and burning them in the stove. The conductor tried to intervene, but was ignored. By the end of the journey, not a single bench remained intact. Everyone sat on the floor, uncomfortable, but finally warm. The railway company filed a complaint, but the court ruled in favor of the passengers, stating that if the railroad could not provide adequate heating, travelers had the right to protect their health by any means necessary. By the early 1850s, conditions slowly improved. More advanced stoves with adjustable draft appeared. Walls were insulated with layers of felt or cork between inner and outer panels. Windows were sealed more tightly, gaps carefully caulked. Still, true winter comfort arrived only with the invention of real sleeping cars. And this is where one man enters the story. The person who transformed overnight train travel from a miserable ordeal into something approaching civilization. His name was George Mortimer Pullman. He was not an aristocrat, nor a formally trained engineer, nor a wealthy industrialist. He was simply a skilled carpenter from New York State. In 1854, at the age of 33, Pullman set out on an overnight journey from Buffalo to Westfield. Expecting some degree of comfort, he purchased a first-class ticket. What he encountered infuriated him. Despite paying a premium, he found himself on a hard, leather-covered bench under dim lighting, surrounded by the snoring of strangers. He spent the night shifting endlessly, searching for a tolerable position. His neck stiffened, his back ached, and by morning he was utterly exhausted. And then the idea struck him. What if a train car allowed passengers to actually lie down? What if there were real beds, like at home? Today it sounds obvious, but in the 1850s, it was revolutionary. Railway companies believed that if a vehicle was moving, passengers should sit. Lying down in public transport was considered improper, almost indecent. A train was not a bedroom. Pullman disagreed. His logic was simple. If a person pays for overnight travel, they deserve sleep. And real sleep is impossible while sitting. Therefore, beds were necessary. The question was how to fit them into a narrow carriage that also needed to function during the day. For the next 10 years, Pullman worked obsessively on this problem. He experimented, drafted designs, and built prototypes. After moving to Chicago, he opened a small workshop and began constructing modified railcars. The early attempts were clumsy. Folding bunks collapsed unexpectedly, mechanisms jammed, everything rattled and creaked. Railway companies watched with skepticism. Why complicate things? People were already traveling. But in 1863, a single event changed everything. After President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, his body needed to be transported from Washington to Springfield across the country. The funeral train was to travel slowly, solemnly, stopping in major cities. The journey would last over a week, and the government commissioned a special mourning car, dignified, elegant, worthy of a president. The order went to Pullman. He created a masterpiece. The car was lined with black velvet, adorned with silver tassels and heavy drapery. Most importantly, it contained a proper bed for the coffin and fold-out sleeping accommodations for those accompanying it. As the funeral train crossed half the nation, thousands of people saw this carriage. They saw that travel could be different, dignified, comfortable, humane. After Lincoln's burial, railway companies began turning to Pullman. Everything changed. Railway companies wanted these cars. They wanted to impress their passengers. And in 1865, just months after the end of the Civil War, Pullman unveiled his first true sleeping car designed for regular service. It was called the Pioneer, and it truly was a revolution on wheels. Let's step inside and see what stunned contemporaries so deeply. By day, the Pioneer looked like an ordinary passenger car, only noticeably more refined. Plush velvet seats, polished wood, mirrors, gas lamps with frosted glass shades. Passengers could sit, read, talk, pass the time. But in the evening, something remarkable happened. The conductor, they soon became known as porters, began transforming the car. Seat backs folded down and connected, turning two facing seats into a wide lower berth. From the wall above, another bunk unfolded. It was mounted on hinges and stayed hidden during the day. The result was a two-tier sleeping compartment. For each berth, the porter laid out proper bedding: sheets, blankets, pillows, real bed linen, white, freshly laundered, stiff with starch. For people who had spent a decade sleeping on bare wooden benches, it felt miraculous. And that wasn't all. Around each berth, the porter hung curtains, heavy, dark green drapes that created a sense of privacy. Pull the curtain closed, and you were no longer in a shared carriage. You were in your own small sleeping cocoon. No one saw you undress, prepare for bed, or snore. It was a level of privacy that trains had never offered before. Public reaction was mixed. Many passengers were thrilled. At last, they could truly sleep, stretch out fully, pull a real blanket over themselves. These people were willing to pay 3 times as much for the experience, and they did. A sleeping berth cost the price of a first-class ticket, plus an additional fee. Expensive, but worth it. Others were outraged. Conservative Victorians found the very idea of sleeping on a train improper. The biggest scandal was that men and women slept in the same car, even if separated by curtains. Immoral, wrote clergy members to newspapers. A threat to public decency, echoed moral guardians. Some even called for sleeping cars to be banned altogether. Pullman, however, was not just an inventor. He was a shrewd businessman. He solved the problem decisively by introducing separate sections. One half of the car was reserved for women and families with children, the other for men traveling alone. A closed door separated the sections, and a porter stood guard to ensure no one crossed the boundary. This calmed the moralists, more or less. There were also practical issues. Early passengers had no idea how to use the berths. People tried climbing onto the upper bunk, wearing boots and heavy coats. They fell, tangled themselves in curtains, forgot to lower the safety net, and sometimes tumbled down in the middle of the night onto the person sleeping below. So Pullman had instructions printed and posted inside the cars. they were unintentionally amusing. In a stern tone, passengers were informed, remove shoes and outerwear before sleeping. Fold belongings neatly and place them in the storage pocket behind the headboard. Use the ladder to climb to the upper berth. Do not attempt to jump. Always lower the safety net. If you need to get up at night, light a candle. Do not walk in the dark. The porters deserve a story of their own. Pullman realized that beds alone were not enough. Someone had to unfold them, make the beds, assist passengers, and maintain order throughout the night. He hired specially trained porters who worked through the night. They wore white jackets with gold buttons, trousers with stripes, and white gloves. They were expected to be unfailingly polite, attentive, and discreet. An important detail: nearly all Pullman porters were African American. Many were former slaves or the children of slaves. For them, this job offered a rare chance at stable income and social mobility. Pullman paid reasonably well, but demanded strict discipline and flawless service. The porters became the face of the company. It was they who created the atmosphere of care and comfort that set Pullman cars apart. Sleeping in a Pullman car still wasn't quite like sleeping at home, but it was incomparably better than wooden benches. The berths were narrow, about 60 centimeters wide. Turning over was difficult. If you lay on your back, you stayed that way until morning. The space between the upper and lower bunk was barely 60 centimeters. Sitting up was impossible, but compared to what had existed before, these were trivial inconveniences. The rhythm of the wheels remained. The car still rattled over rail joints, swayed, jolted. Yet lying flat made the motion easier to bear. The body relaxed, muscles loosened, and the curtains created the illusion of a protected space, a small private world. Many people found it easier to fall asleep inside that dark, enclosed capsule. Heating in Pullman cars was also thoughtfully designed. Instead of dangerous coal stoves, Pullman used steam heating. Hot steam from the locomotive flowed through pipes into radiators installed along the walls. The temperature stayed relatively even, no tropical heat near a stove, no Arctic chill by the doors. In winter, Pullman cars were warm and reasonably comfortable. By 1870, Pullman cars operated across the United States. The Pullman Palace Car Company had become a giant of the railway industry. Pullman didn't sell his cars, he leased them, retaining control over service quality. Every car belonged to Pullman. Every porter was his employee. This ensured consistent standards nationwide. Europeans initially viewed the American innovation with skepticism. They favored compartment cars with enclosed cabins. But gradually, Pullman's ideas began crossing the Atlantic, adapted, of course, to European sensibilities. We'll come back to that later. For now, it's important to remember that the Pullman car was more than a technical innovation. It was a social revolution. For the first time, people of modest means could buy a ticket and sleep almost like at home. Not in a canopy bed, of course, but on a real bunk with sheets and a pillow. The democratization of comfort, a beautiful phrase. But in practice, things turned out more complex. Because when you lock 30 strangers inside one carriage for an entire night, give them beds, and ask them to sleep, real social drama inevitably begins. A sleeping car quickly turned into a small society of its own, with unwritten rules, taboos, conflicts, and stories that passengers remembered for years. The night followed a familiar ritual. Imagine the train departing around 8 in the evening. Passengers take their seats, exchange small talk, unfold newspapers, settle in. Around 9 o'clock, the porter begins walking down the aisle, quietly asking, "Shall I prepare your berth now?" It was a polite way to find out who was ready for bed. Because transforming the car was neither silent nor instant. You couldn't unfold one berth without disturbing several neighbors. Usually, families with small children and elderly passengers were the first to agree. The porter would start with them. He asked passengers to step aside, then within minutes turned 2 seats into a lower berth, unfolded the upper one, laid fresh linen, and drew the curtains. When passengers returned, a real bed awaited them. It felt like magic. But then came the practical question: where to change clothes? There were no private changing rooms, only a tiny restroom at the end of the car, and a line almost immediately formed. Most people ended up changing behind their curtains, right on their narrow berths. And that's when the acrobatics began. Try removing a corset or changing a shirt in a space barely 60 centimeters wide and high, while the train rocks and sways. Elbows bump into walls, heads hit the upper bunk, legs tangle in clothing. For women, it was especially difficult. Dresses with bustles, tightly laced corsets, layered petticoats, all of it had to be removed, folded, and somehow stuffed into a travel bag. Many women prepared in advance, bringing loose nightgowns or robes, something decent enough to step out in, just in case. Even so, changing remained an awkward and deeply private ordeal. Men had it easier. Jacket off, collar loosened, tie removed, and that was often enough. The most practical simply slept dressed, removing only shoes and waistcoats. More proper gentlemen changed into nightshirts and sleeping caps. Yes, adult men in the 19th century commonly slept in caps. It was considered hygienic and respectable. Now imagine the soundscape of the sleeping car at night. At its core was the steady rhythm of the wheels, repetitive, hypnotic. Layered over it came the creaking. The wooden car groaned at every joint. Walls, floor, ceiling, berths, everything creaked. With every turn, every acceleration or brake, the car seemed to sigh like a living creature. And then there was snoring. 30 people in one enclosed space. Some whistled softly, others rumbled thunderously, some snorted and wheezed. It became a full orchestra of snoring in multiple registers. Curtains provided visual privacy, but acoustically, nothing was hidden. You heard everything. Those unable to sleep began coughing pointedly, tapping on partitions, rustling newspapers, subtle hints aimed at the offender. Sometimes it worked. The snorer would wake, turn onto their side, and fall silent. For half an hour, then it would start again. The most desperate called for the porter. He would gently open the curtain and whisper politely, "Sir, might I ask you to turn onto your side? Your sleep is disturbing others." Nighttime trips to the restroom were a chapter of social life, all their own. The lavatory sat at the very end of the car. To reach it, one had to climb down from the berth, slip past the curtain, and walk the narrow aisle between sleeping passengers. Lighting was dim, one or two lamps burning low. You moved by touch, holding onto rails. The train swayed, feet slid, curtains stirred. From behind them came sounds, snoring, murmurs, creaking beds. Now imagine a woman in a long nightgown navigating this obstacle course without tripping, brushing curtains, or waking fellow passengers. It required real skill. Many preferred to endure until morning rather than risk a nocturnal journey, especially women who felt exposed appearing before strangers in sleepwear. The restroom itself was tiny. A wash basin, a toilet, a single hook for a towel, nothing more. No space to linger. And often a queue. In the early morning, around 6 or 7, a proper line formed. Sleepy figures in robes and nightshirts waited, yawning. Sometimes men gallantly let women go first. Sometimes arguments broke out over who arrived earlier. Porters were not just attendants. They were mediators and informal therapists. They smoothed over conflicts, calmed irritated passengers, negotiated compromises. If someone complained about a snorer, the porter might offer an empty berth at the other end of the car. If someone felt cold, he brought an extra blanket. If sleep refused to come, a glass of warm milk from the buffet. A good porter knew his passengers, who liked their berth prepared early, who preferred the upper bunk, who always asked for an extra pillow. He woke passengers at the right time, some an hour before arrival, others half an hour. He'd tap softly on the partition and whisper, "Good morning, Mr. Johnson. 40 minutes to Pittsburgh. Would you care for some tea?" Tips were a crucial part of a porter's income. Official wages were modest. Most of their earnings came from gratuities, so porters worked hard to please everyone. By the end of a journey, grateful passengers might give $1 or $2, a respectable sum at the time. Generous travelers gave more. Those who gave nothing were quietly judged. There were plenty of memorable incidents. Once, on a Chicago-New York route, a man sleeping on the upper berth forgot to secure the safety net. He rolled over in his sleep and fell straight down onto an elderly woman below. The screams woke the entire car. The woman was terrified. The man was horrified. The porter had to calm everyone, offer the woman smelling salts, and gently explain the importance of safety nets. Another time, a newlywed couple traveled on their honeymoon. They were given 2 adjacent lower berths. At night, they drew their curtains slightly apart and began whispering across the aisle. Unfortunately, in a sleeping car, whispers carry better than normal speech. The entire carriage became an unwilling audience to their tender confessions. In the morning, the couple stepped out red-faced, under quiet giggles from fellow passengers. There were touching moments, too. An elderly man traveling to his son's funeral couldn't sleep. He cried softly behind his curtain. The porter noticed, brought him hot tea, sat beside him, talked quietly. By morning, the man had calmed and even managed a short nap. Later, he wrote to the Pullman company thanking the porter for his kindness. Children were both a delight and a challenge. They loved the strange rocking beds and treated the journey like an adventure. But putting them to sleep was difficult. They wriggled, peeked out from curtains, ran down the aisle. Parents hissed, "Quiet, people are sleeping." Sometimes children fell from upper berths. Sometimes they grew nauseous from the motion. Porters kept peppermint candies on hand to soothe nerves and stomachs alike. By morning, the car woke gradually. Early risers, business travelers who needed to look sharp, stirred first. They dressed quietly, visited the restroom, returned groomed and composed. Then the rest of the passengers followed. Morning bustle began. Queues, packing, folding blankets. The porter moved down the aisle, folding berths back into seats, collecting linens. Within 20 minutes, the sleeping car became an ordinary daytime carriage again. Passengers sat on benches, sipped morning coffee from thermoses, gazed out at the approaching city, as if the night had never happened, except the tired faces told another story. Because sleeping in a sleeping car, even with a bed and clean sheets, was never quite like sleeping at home. It was a special kind of sleep, light, fragmented, alert. Sleep in a sleeping car was always on the edge between rest and wakefulness. Every creak, every stop, every tiny sound was heard. Yet even this sleep was far better than spending the night on a hard bench. People learned to adapt, gradually becoming used to the specific rhythm of sleeping cars. But Europe chose a very different direction. The American open-plan layout with curtains did not catch on there. Europeans had their own ideas about comfort and privacy. They wanted real walls, real doors, and real locks. The idea of sleeping in one room with dozens of strangers felt unacceptable. So Europe developed the compartment system. The carriage was divided into separate enclosed compartments, the classic European coupe. Each compartment had its own lock, its own window, and its own private space. Depending on the class, 2 to 6 passengers could travel in one coupe. Imagine a first-class coupe from the late 1870s. A small room about 2 by 2.5 meters. Along the walls were soft benches covered in leather or velvet, with luggage racks above them. Heavy curtains hung over the window, and a gas lamp glowed under a glass shade. The most important feature was the door, which locked from the inside. At night, the benches transformed into beds. The backs folded down, the seats slid forward, and 2 wide berths appeared. If 4 people traveled together, 2 more bunks could be folded down from the wall. A conductor brought linens, mattresses, and pillows. Passengers either made their own beds or asked for help. The key difference from the American approach was complete privacy. Close the door, and you were in your own small world. You could undress freely, turn the light on or off, snore as loudly as you liked. Your companions were usually people you knew, or at least tolerated. But there was a downside. If you traveled alone, strangers could be assigned to your compartment. That was when the real lottery began. Sometimes you got pleasant, polite people to chat with. Sometimes you got a drunk, a bore, or someone with bad habits. And there was nowhere to escape. The door was locked. Single women especially feared traveling in mixed compartments. Railway companies tried to solve this by creating ladies-only compartments. But there were never enough of them, and women sometimes had to travel in mixed compartments, keeping their travel dresses on and staying alert. Men were also wary of their companions. Trains in the 19th century were popular with pickpockets and scammers. They bought tickets, sat near wealthy passengers, gained trust with conversation, and then stole from them while they slept. Some even drugged drinks. Newspapers constantly warned, "Do not accept gifts from strangers. Sleep with your luggage under your head. Lock your compartment from the inside." Second class was more modest. Smaller compartments, harder benches, no velvet. But it still offered a closed space. Third class often had no sleeping places at all. People sat or slept wherever they could, but at least they were separated from others by a door. Winter heating presented the same problems as in America, but Europeans handled them differently. Steam heating was expensive and complicated in compartment cars. Pipes and radiators had to be installed in each compartment and maintained carefully. So many trains relied on portable heaters, metal boxes filled with hot coals placed under the seats. They warmed the compartment for several hours, but were dangerous, as coals could fall out and start fires. The Germans came up with a safer solution: metal heaters filled with sodium acetate. Heated with boiling water at the station, they could release warmth for up to 12 hours. They were heavy, about 15 kilograms, and had to be carried from compartment to compartment. The French experimented with electric heaters. By the 1880s, some lines had cars equipped with generators powered by the motion of the wheels. The electricity was used for lighting and heating, but the system was unreliable. The English, loyal to tradition, resisted heating the longest. Their philosophy was that a gentleman does not fear cold. But after several scandals and parliamentary complaints from frozen passengers, they had to give in. By the end of the 19th century, steam heating appeared in British trains as well. Ventilation in winter remained a constant headache. 6 people in a compartment, windows sealed shut, and frost outside. The air quickly became stale and heavy. Opening a window meant letting in icy air. So arguments always broke out. Some passengers wanted fresh air. Others wanted to keep warm. Engineers tried to solve the problem with technical solutions: ventilation valves, heat recovery systems. But the technology was imperfect and often failed. By the end of the 19th century, 2 distinct schools of railway comfort had emerged: the American open, democratic model with porters and curtains, and the European private model with compartments and doors. Each had its advantages and disadvantages. American cars were social and lively, with porters always nearby. But privacy was limited. European compartments offered complete privacy, but if your companions were unpleasant, you were trapped with them for the whole night. Russian trains borrowed the European compartment system, but added their own twist. Compartments were more spacious, and samovars were often provided for tea. The tradition of long conversations with fellow passengers became a part of Russian rail culture. People didn't just sleep quietly, they talked, shared food, and told stories. By the early 20th century, both systems had matured. Luxurious sleeping cars with private cabins, showers, hot water, and electric lighting appeared. Dining cars, lounge cars, and even library cars emerged. Train travel transformed from a test of endurance into a pleasure. Thus began the golden age of railway sleep, the era of legendary trains like the Orient Express and the Trans-Siberian. Trains became more than transportation. They became a symbol of progress, romance, and lifestyle. By the end of the 19th century, railway companies understood one simple truth. People were willing to pay, not just to move from point A to point B, but for the experience, the comfort, and the memories. And so began the golden age of rail travel, the era when the sleeping car stopped being merely a way to get from point A to point B and became a true work of art on wheels, began in the early 20th century. In 1901, the World's Fair opened in Paris, and one of its most striking exhibits was a model of the new Simplon Orient Express train car. People lined up to look inside, amazed at what they saw. It was no longer just a railroad carriage. It was a floating hotel, a palace on rails, a marvel of engineering and design. A wide corridor covered with thick carpet that softened every step. Walls of mahogany panels inlaid with mother of pearl. A ceiling decorated with ornate plasterwork. Along the corridor were doors, but these were not ordinary compartments. They were small cabins, each with a polished brass nameplate and a door that locked from the inside. Let's step into a luxury cabin. The space is the size of a modest hotel room. A sofa upholstered in damask, a gilded mirror on the wall, a small marble table by the window, and a lamp with a stained glass shade. In the corner, a wash basin with both hot and cold water, something that seemed like fantasy on a train at that time. In the evening, the sofa transformed into a large bed with a spring mattress, Egyptian cotton sheets, and feather pillows. A cashmere blanket completed the setting. Here, you could sleep comfortably as a couple without fear of falling or disturbing each other. A luxury unimaginable to passengers of the 1840s. But the marvel was not only the beds. Every cabin had an electric call button to summon an attendant. Want tea, a newspaper, a snack, or assistance? Press the button. And within a minute, a staff member would be at your door. Electric lighting with adjustable brightness, ventilation valves that maintained fresh air without stuffiness, and steam heating. Everything was designed for comfort, and comfort became the essence of the golden age. Travel stopped being just movement. It became an event people prepared for in advance. Women ordered new travel outfits from tailors. Men bought expensive leather suitcases, and crowds gathered on the platform to watch elegantly dressed passengers board. The dining car became the heart of social life on the train. White tablecloths, silver cutlery, crystal glasses, French cuisine, wine, conversations, new acquaintances, deals, and romances. After dinner, passengers moved to the lounge car, played cards, smoked, read, or listened to music. By 10 or 11 p.m., everyone returned to their cabins, where beds were already made and the linens were laid out. Sleeping in such a cabin felt almost like sleeping at home. A wide bed, a soft mattress, the rhythmic sound of wheels, everything was soothing. Even if you couldn't afford the luxury class, second-class cabins on a good train were still comfortable. Clean sheets, proper ventilation, and heating. But the golden age was not only about luxury. It was also about journeys that lasted a lifetime. The Trans-Siberian Railway offered its own version of comfort. Spacious cabins where passengers could live, not just sleep. People traveled with wardrobes, books, and even musical instruments. The journey took more than a week, and over that time, passengers formed a kind of temporary community, sharing tea, watching endless landscapes, and stopping at small stations to stretch their legs and buy pastries. In winter, the experience was especially striking. Outside, frost and blizzards; inside, warmth, lamps, and samovars. It was a unique feeling, speeding through a frozen continent inside a warm cocoon of civilization. But the Golden Age could not last forever. World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II all struck a blow to luxury travel, turning trains into tools of evacuation, troop transport, and refugee movement. Many luxurious carriages were repurposed or destroyed. After the war, railways tried to regain their former glory, but the world had changed. Airplanes began to carry passengers faster than any train, and cars gave people the freedom to travel on their own terms. Trains gradually lost their advantage in speed and convenience. Luxurious sleeping cars became rare, almost museum pieces. Today we live in an era of high-speed rail. Japanese Shinkansen, French TGVs, and Chinese bullet trains rush along at around 300 km/h. Modern sleeping cars are equipped with air conditioning, TVs, power outlets, showers, bidet toilets, and Wi-Fi. Technically, it is perfection, but something has been lost. The romance of slow travel has faded, the feeling of not rushing, of the journey being as important as the destination. The tradition of long conversations with fellow travelers, learning the stories of strangers, has disappeared. The sense of adventure that once came with traveling by night train has faded too. Passengers in the 1840s believed sleeping on a moving train was torture. Travelers in the golden age of the early 20th century considered it a luxury and a pleasure. And we modern travelers take it for granted. Sit down, lie down, fall asleep, wake up, step off. Simple and fast. But if you stop to think about it, it is a miracle. Falling asleep in one place and waking up in another, passing through cities and countries during the night while staying in a warm bed. Our ancestors dreamed of such a thing. To them, it would have seemed like magic. Maybe we should sometimes remember history. Remember the hard benches and kerosene lamps, the dangerous stoves and hot bricks under your feet. Remember Pullman's invention and the work of thousands of porters. Remember the luxury cars of the Orient Express and the cozy cabins of the Trans-Siberian. All of it is part of our shared story, the story of how humanity learned to tame distance, how we learned to sleep while moving, how we turned discomfort into comfort. And who knows, perhaps in 100 years, our descendants will smile at the thought of how we once slept on trains in the early 21st century. They may travel in magnetic levitation, trains at incredible speeds, in sleeping capsules where artificial gravity creates the feeling of complete stillness. And they will write a history of how their ancestors once slept in primitive iron carriages on steel rails. The circle will close because progress never stops. But one thing remains unchanged: the human need for comfort, warmth, and safety during sleep. Whether we are on a hard bench in the 19th century, in a luxury cabin of the early 20th, or in a modern high-speed train, we are still the same people seeking rest at the end of a long day. And that is something deeply human and touching. Good night, and may you dream of trains, the slow, romantic ones that glide through the night with lights in the windows and the rhythmic sound of wheels. The ones that still carry the spirit of the great age of rail travel.